Welcome to our nervous system unit. The nervous system is definitely one of the most mysterious systems that we have in the human body. And it's one of the things and one of the systems that we're still learning about. But we'll go into deeper functions about the nervous system. And some of the organs are going to be the brain and spinal cord that will make up the central nervous system and our peripheral nerves, as well as our special senses. So this unit will also cover the sense of sight and sound and taste, smell also, as well a little bit about equilibrium. The nervous system can be organized into the central nervous system, which I usually abbreviate as the CNS, that consists of the brain and spinal cord, and the peripheral nervous system, or PNS, which consists of the other nerves. There are cranial nerves that will originate in the spine, and then we'll have spinal nerves that originate in the spinal cord. And we can further divide that peripheral nervous system. So if we look at the peripheral nervous system, this is going to compose of all of the nerves that are not inside of the brain or the spinal cord. So they can be coming off of the brain as a cranial nerve or off of the spinal cord as a spinal nerve, but they are not inside of that brain or spinal cord. And then we're going to have sensory nerves or an afferent fibers, creating the afferent division that sends information from your senses to the central nervous system. And then we have the motor division that has efferent nerve fibers that go away from the central nervous system and target muscles and glands. So we can further divide the efferent or motor division. We can further divide that into the autonomic or visceral nervous system. That includes involuntary muscle control, like the iris of your eye or the erector pili muscle of your integument, the smooth muscle that lines your gastrointestinal tracts or your blood vessels. And then the somatic nervous system is going to be where you have voluntary muscle control, so like your skeletal muscle. And then we can further divide the autonomic or visceral nervous system into the sympathetic division and the parasympathetic division. The sympathetic division, you should think of like fight or flight, like there's a bear chasing me. This is used in emergency situations, whereas the parasympathetic division is more of the rest and digest. You're chilling in your bed or on your couch and you're scrolling through TikTok and you are relaxing. So in that type of situation, it will counteract the sympathetic division and it will guide energy towards urine production and digestion. So blood flow to the skeletal muscle will be more cut off and blood will be directed towards those visceral organs like the intestines and the liver and the stomach. Whereas if your sympathetic division is activated, think of like fight or flight. So your blood will be directed more towards your skeletal muscle, your heart, and your lungs to deliver oxygen to those vital organs and your skeletal muscle so you can get out of whatever stressful situation you are in. And blood will be directed away from those digestive organs that are going to break down food and produce urine. The nervous system is like the master control center of the body, and it works hand in hand with the endocrine system, which is the first system you'll pick up on in 202. And they work very similarly. It's just the endocrine system is more of a wireless connection, where the nervous system is more of a wired connection. And so the nervous system works very, very quickly, and the endocrine system will work more slowly, but usually be longer lasting, and that is due to those hormones. So both of these systems will use our feedback loops that we learned way back in Unit 1 in order to do their job. There will be some kind of sensory input, and that input will include our receptors. So if it's in our skin, maybe it's a change in temperature. If it is in our eyes, there's a photoreceptor, maybe they're detecting a bear chasing us. But there is some kind of sensory input, and that will detect a stimulus. That it could be inside the body or it could be outside the body. And then that will be directed towards the central nervous system through an afferent or sensory pathway. And then there's going to be some kind of integration, which is the processing and interpreting of the information. This happens in the central nervous system, so within the brain or the spinal cord. And then there's going to be some kind of response. So the brain will make a decision, and then that decision will leave the brain through an efferent or motor pathway. And then there will be some kind of response. So that efferent division will act on typically a skeletal muscle or a gland or some other muscle in order to have a response. So we will start with the central nervous system. Central nervous system includes both the brain and the spinal cord. And these structures are very delicate, and that delicate tissue is protected by layers of connective tissue that are called the meninges. The most superficial layer or outermost layer of the connective tissue meninges is the dura mater. This is a very dense, fibrous connective tissue that is very thick. It literally means tough mother in the name dura mater. And if you ever try to or have ever in class dissected a brain and had this dura mater on it, it is very, very tough, and it's because of that dense fibrous connective tissue. The next layer is the arachnoid layer. And in between that arachnoid layer and the dura mater, there is a subdural space. The arachnoid is going to be a thin, kind of cobwebby-like layer, which is where it gets its name. And then underneath that arachnoid layer, there will be a subarachnoid space. And then there will be a thin layer that contains lots and lots of blood vessels that is right on top of the brain, and it goes into all of the grooves of the brain, and it contains all of the blood vessels called the pia mater. So if we go from superficial to deep, we can start with the skin, and you know that the skin is connected to bone by the periosteum. And just underneath the bone, we're going to have that first meninge layer called the dura mater. Underneath that dura mater will be the subdural space. And then we have the arachnoid mater or arachnoid layer. That's this cobwebby-like layer. And we're going to talk about these projections that go out of that arachnoid layer. There's a lot of fluid called cerebral spinal fluid that goes through this arachnoid layer. And then there will be a subarachnoid space. And then the most superficial layer of the meninges is the pia mater. And that pia mater goes deep into each of these grooves of the brain, and the blood vessels will be deeply embedded in this pia mater to provide nourishment to that brain tissue. Between the arachnoid layer and the pia mater, we're going to find cerebral spinal fluid. And that fluid protects the brain by preventing it from contacting the skull. We know that the skull is a very hardened and bony casing, and we've investigated the all of those nooks and crannies of the brain. Some of those projections are kind of pointy. And so if the brain was sitting directly on that, that would damage that delicate nervous tissue. So the cerebral spinal fluid is actually going to suspend the brain. If you think about like an egg, not a cooked egg, like a raw egg in the shell, if you were to put that into Tupperware and shake that Tupperware, that egg would hit the side of the Tupperware and it would break. And the egg would be splattered. Well, that's kind of the same way that your brain works. If the Tupperware is the cranium and the egg is your brain, if you were to fill that Tupperware up with water and then close it and shake that egg around, it's not going to break because that water slows down the brain or the egg, I should say, as it's moving around in the Tupperware. The same way the cerebral spinal fluid slows down the brain as it's moving through the casing. So if you were to all of a sudden come to a quick stop, your brain's not going to slam into the skull bones. It's going to be slowed down by that cerebral spinal fluid. The cerebral spinal fluid is also going to maintain the blood-brain barrier, and that blood-brain barrier controls homeostasis for the brain, and it prevents infection. So only certain things can pass through this blood-brain barrier, such as glucose and ketones, and unfortunately, syphilis can get through that blood-brain barrier. But the blood-brain barrier is usually really good at keeping everything out of the central nervous system that should not be able to get into it. And it's usually really good at preventing infections. So the cerebral spinal fluid is actually produced in spaces within the brain called ventricles. And there are 4 ventricles in the brain. 2 are called lateral ventricles. There's the right and left lateral ventricle. And then there is the 3rd ventricle and then the 4th ventricle. So if you follow the lateral ventricles here, getting to that 3rd ventricle, there is this interventricular foramen that connects those. And then the 4th ventricle is down here by that little brain called the cerebellum. What is producing the cerebral spinal fluid is deep in those ventricles called the choroid plexus. Those secrete cerebral spinal fluid and it will flow around the brain through the ventricles. And then as it flows through the brain, it will be reabsorbed by these arachnoid granules within the dura, right? So you have this subarachnoid layer here, and then that dura mater, and you can see the arachnoid granules kind of push up and out into that dura mater, and they're going to absorb that cerebral spinal fluid. And the cerebral spinal fluid is constantly being produced in these inner layers of the choroid plexus, circulated throughout the ventricles, and then reabsorbed in those arachnoid granules. The big part of the brain is called the cerebrum. And the cerebrum has these ridges or raised portions called gyri. That's plural, gyrus for singular. And these sunken portions called sulci or sulcus. And deep sulci are called fissures. And so if you look at the deep portion of the brain, inside of the brain, so the only way to see it would be to cut the brain in half, we will have what is called the diencephalon. And this is going to include three structures called the thalamus, the hypothalamus, and the pineal gland. The thalamus is going to act like a sorting center that receives information from sensory or afferent pathways, and it's going to deliver the information to the appropriate area of the cerebrum. And so these different ridges of the brain, these different portions of the gyri, will process different information from different parts of the brain. And that's where that integration piece will happen. The hypothalamus is going to be like the control or the master controller of what's called the pituitary gland. And then we have the pineal gland that is going to control our sleep-wake cycles and the secretion of melatonin. The thalamus, if you were to cut the brain in a cross section, like a medial or a mid-sagittal section right through the brain, you will cut the brain directly in half and you will see the thalamus. But the thalamus is actually two bulbs. So if you were to cut the brain differently, like this way, doing a transverse section through the brain, you'd actually see those two bulbs here. So it has these two bulb shapes that are in the center of the brain. And the sensory information will go into the central nervous system and it will travel up through the spinal cord and go through the brain stem here and go to the thalamus. And then the thalamus will direct that information to the particular part of the brain that is going to process that information. And so the cerebral cortex is the outermost portion of the brain that is full of cell bodies and dendrites of sensory or processing neurons. And then just behind the thalamus, this little guy, this little P-shaped guy, that is the pineal gland. And he secretes melatonin that controls your sleep-wake cycle. Just below the thalamus is the hypothalamus, and that is this region right here. It has several functions that are part of visceral or autonomic processes like metabolism or blood volume control or the temperature of your body. And the major player that controls what hormones are released in your body is this gland here called the pituitary gland. But this pituitary gland is more like middle management because he has a boss. And his boss is the hypothalamus. And so this hypothalamus will tell the pituitary gland which hormones to release to control every other endocrine gland in the body. And the hypothalamus has both neuronal control of the pituitary gland and hormonal control of the pituitary gland. So he can release hormones, and there will be a neuronal stimulation of it. The hypothalamus is also considered to be part of your limbic system. Your limbic system is going to happen in the deep regions of the brain, like here, that regulate your emotions and how you feel, if you're hungry or thirsty, or if you're in pain. And then we have some structures that are between the cerebrum and the spinal cord that is known as the brainstem. So the brainstem can be broken up into three regions. The most superior region just underneath the hypothalamus and the thalamus is called the midbrain. And then there's going to be this first portion inferior to the cerebrum that kind of protrudes outward called the pons. And then this oblong region called the medulla oblongata. The midbrain is also known as the mesencephalon, and this will relay information to the cerebrum, specifically internal or visceral components that will go to the limbic system, or this internal portion of the cerebrum. It will also, just inferior to the midbrain, we have this large portion that kind of sticks out. It reminds me of like a little pregnant belly. And I think of that as the pons. But pons does mean bridge. It is made up completely of white matter. And that white matter actually comes from the axons or tail ends of nerves. So if you remember from the nervous or the tissues unit, we talked about nervous tissue. And one of the things we talked about was how we talked about the most common type of neuron called a multipolar neuron. And so this multipolar neuron will have a soma, or a cell body, that has these dendrites coming off of it, and those dendrites can receive information. And then coming off of that soma is this long tail called an axon. And that axon will end up ending in these terminal branches. Well, these axons can have specialized cells called either oligodendrocytes or Schwann cells that wrap around them. And that wrapping is called myelination, which increases the electrical conduction speed of a nerve impulse. So instead of a nerve impulse having to travel all the way down the axon bit by bit, this myelination allows the nerve impulse to jump large sections of this axon into these spaces that are not myelinated. So the white matter that makes up these pons is actually that myelination of axons. And it's connecting the cerebral cortex to the cerebellum. So we can initiate movement, or we can initiate a decision in this outermost portion of the brain, and then we're going to fine tune it here in the cerebrum or cerebellum. And so this pons acts as a bridge that's going to carry information from one part of the brain to the other part of the brain. The medulla oblongata is this oblong area that is just above the spinal cord and is flush, kind of just runs right into the spinal cord. This area will transmit impulses between the spinal cord and the brain, And in this area is where we have the control of blood pressure, heart rate, swallowing, and coughing. So if you've ever seen The Water Boy, I'm so sorry to break it to you, but the medulla oblongata is not the area of aggression, and alligators don't have an enlarged medulla oblongata that makes more angry. But if you think about when you get angry, your blood pressure usually goes up, your heart rate goes up, your respiratory rate goes up. So the medulla oblongata is very involved in that response, but the anger is going to come from the limbic system. The cerebellum is going to be this little brain in the back portion of the skull. And it is separated from the cerebrum by what's called the transverse fissure. And there's this little tag called the infundibulum that will connect the two to keep them from kind of flopping away from each other. But it is in the back of the skull, and it's the second largest part of the brain. This is the part of the brain that will be responsible for making your movements graceful and efficient involuntarily. It's also where we have our muscle memory developed. So if you've been practicing in a new sport, the cerebellum is the portion of the brain that is going to make that muscle memory. When it comes to the spinal cord extends from the medulla oblongata all the way down to the lumbar vertebrae. And just like the brain, it is covered in meninges for protection. So we'll have those same dura mater, arachnoid, and pia mater. The spinal cord will relay impulses between the peripheral nervous system and the brain, and we actually have 31 pairs of spinal nerves, so 62 in total. And if we were to take a cross section of the spinal cord, it would actually kind of look like a butterfly. And what makes up the butterfly is actually gray matter that is surrounded by white matter. And then we will have these horns that receive impulses from afferent or sensory nerves. And then we have the efferent or ventral horns, the ventral horns that will have the efferent nerves that go out to a motor muscle or gland. The dorsal and ventral roots have nerve fibers, and they will create a two-directional spinal nerve. So this is where we'll pick up next time talking about the spinal cord. Start with the spinal cord and that portion of the central nervous system, and then we'll go into the brain, and then we will talk about the special functions or senses.